Welcome to Midnight and Murder Crime Stories. Perfect for late hours, heavy eyelids, in the space between wake and sleep. Dim the lights, let the quiet take hold, and let the stories carry you. Let's go. Story 1, The Glass Hotel. It was the cold that first gave her pause. Not the kind that nipped at fingertips or bit through scarves, but a cold that lingered behind the eyes. The kind of cold that clung to the wallpaper, seeped between the floorboards, and whispered beneath the silence. Detective Mara Ellison hadn't been in the mountains for years, not since the accident, and certainly not since she left the force. But the letter was signed in a hand she couldn't ignore. The envelope had no return address, just the faint scent of pine and the words, "Come before the thaw." Inside, a single sheet bore a name she hadn't heard in over a decade. Vivian Arlo, a novelist, recluse, and one-time subject of a very public investigation that Mara had helped quietly dissolve. Now Vivian was dead, officially by natural causes. Unofficially, the letter suggested otherwise. The Glass Hotel sat alone on a cliff's edge, shuttered since the pandemic, its windows reflecting clouds instead of guests. Mara arrived at dusk, her boots crunching on frozen gravel. The wind carried the scent of snow and something metallic, maybe old iron railings, maybe blood. As she stepped inside, the air turned still, expectant. No power, no staff, just dust motes in the quiet. Waiting. A fire had once burned in the marble hearth of the lounge. Now ashes curled like black petals at its base. A glass of wine, full, untouched, rested on the piano. A guest book lay open to a single signature. Vivian's, dated 2 days before her reported time of death. But Vivian had lived here permanently. Why sign in? The mystery thickened as Mara made her way through the dim halls. Room 206 was locked. Not unusual, except there was no key on the wall behind reception. Only a gap. She didn't sleep that first night. Instead, she sat by the fireless hearth and listened. And somewhere between 3 and 4 a.m., she heard it. Glass clinking, footsteps above, and a piano note, just one, hanging in the air like a held breath. Mara spent the next morning searching the hotel with a quiet, deliberate rhythm. She moved through the ballroom, the empty kitchen, the bar still stocked with dust-covered bottles. Every surface spoke of abandonment, but nothing had the urgency of crime. It wasn't until she stepped into the conservatory that she felt it again, that particular strain of silence that precedes a revelation. The conservatory faced the cliff. Ivy had overgrown the stone path outside, and shards of broken glass lay where a high window had once arched. In the corner stood a chaise lounge with a wool shawl draped neatly over the back. There was no dust on it. On the floor beneath the chaise, Mara found a small square notebook. The pages inside were thick with ink, scribbled and overworked, crossed out and underlined again. They weren't story drafts. They were observations. Tuesday, the hallway creaks even when no one walks. Wednesday, the wine glass again. Same amount, same place. Thursday, he speaks through the walls now. His voice is gentler. Vivian's handwriting was unmistakable, long looping strokes from an era of cursive schooling. But these notes weren't fictional. They read like a record, as if she had been documenting something she didn't understand. At the back of the notebook, a pressed flower was tucked between pages, a violet, dry but intact. The ink near it bled slightly, as if the page had been wet. Mara pocketed the notebook and turned slowly in the quiet glass room. Outside, the wind had stilled. The hotel felt heavier now, as though it remembered something. That afternoon, she returned to room 206. This time, she pressed her ear to the door. Nothing. Then a click. A shift in the air, subtle and soft. The door opened an inch. Inside, it was dark. Heavy curtains were drawn. The air smelled of lavender and aged paper. A fire had been laid in the grate but never lit. A mirror over the dresser was draped in black silk. On the bed lay a second guest book, leather-bound and unsigned. And beside it, a cassette recorder, labeled simply, "For Mara." Mara stared at the cassette for a long moment before slipping it into the old tape deck she'd brought out of habit. A click, a soft whir, and then the grainy hiss of analog static. Vivian's voice followed, slower than Mara remembered, measured, tired. "If you're hearing this," she began, "then you came, and you've seen at least some of what I saw, or heard, or dreamed. I'm not sure which anymore." The line keeps shifting. Mara sat on the edge of the bed, watching the curtains sway slightly as the voice continued. "I didn't mean to lie to anyone, but the stories, they came too fast at the end. Some days I wasn't sure whether I was writing them or remembering them." A pause, a breath. "There's a drawer behind the fireplace in the blue study. You'll need the notebook. The flower pressed inside it. It's not decoration, it's the key. Press it to the drawer's face. Gently. You'll understand." The tape stopped with a soft, mechanical thunk. Mara left the room in silence, walked down the west corridor past 3 old portraits, and turned into the blue study. She hadn't spent time there yet. It smelled faintly of cedar and something floral beneath it. Violet. She lit a match, found the drawer, and pressed the flower against its wood. Nothing at first, then a soft click as the wood yielded slightly inward. Inside was a sheaf of yellowing manuscript pages wrapped in a silk scarf. The handwriting was Vivian's, but different, straighter, confident. Each page described not just moments in the hotel, but specific days, storm warnings, missing guests, items moved without explanation, a record of patterns, cycles. Then Mara saw the names. Her own, listed on the final page months before she'd received the letter. Vivian had been writing her into the story before Mara even arrived. A chill deeper than the mountain cold ran down her spine. Somewhere above her, glass clinked again, and the piano sounded a second note. That night, Mara sat again by the fireless hearth. Snow pressed gently against the windows, a hush so complete it felt deliberate. She read Vivian's manuscript by candlelight, following the careful chronology of small, unexplained occurrences. Wine moved, footsteps in unlit corridors, phrases whispered through radiators. Vivian had tracked them with obsessive clarity. She believed the hotel had a pattern, a memory. She'd stopped thinking of it as haunted. Not a ghost, one line read, but a place with the ability to revisit itself. At 2:47 a.m., Mara heard it again. The piano. This time a third note, then a fourth, a slow, patient sequence echoing through the stairwell. She climbed toward the sound, past peeling wallpaper and warped portraits, until she reached the ballroom. It was dark except for the milky light of snow spilling through the high windows. The piano stood at the far end, keys dusted in frost. No one there. Yet the lid was open. On the bench, a book, one of Vivian's early novels, The Silent Wing. Mara opened it to find the pages hollowed out. Inside, a cassette, unlabeled. She returned to room 206 and played it. Vivian's voice again, this time steadier. "I tried to tell it like fiction, but the hotel didn't want fiction. It wanted truth. The more I fictionalized, the more it slipped away. But when I wrote what really happened, the hotel listened, and it answered." She paused, a faint intake of breath. "If you're reading this now, it means you're part of it, not trapped, witnessed. The rooms echo because someone must remember them. And when memory fades, a long silence. Then the final words, you will keep the story alive." The tape clicked. The room fell still. In the hall, the footsteps began again. But this time, Mara did not chase them. She waited. Because she knew some stories do not end. They linger gently in the walls of quiet places. And they wait for the next person to listen. As dawn broke, a pale gold light filtered through the old hotel's windows. Mara brewed a cup of tea in the abandoned kitchen, its silence now companionable. She no longer searched for ghosts, only traces. Memories pressed between pages, imprinted into wallpaper, folded into the scent of lavender and smoke. She didn't pack her things, not yet. There was more to read, more to uncover. Not for answers, but for meaning. The truth Vivian left wasn't about a crime, a haunting, or even the end of a life. It was about what places remember when people stop looking. And Mara, quietly, had become the memory's keeper. The piano in the ballroom played a fifth note, soft, clear, and solitary. The story continued. The village of Penmere was the kind of place where time settled like dust, soft, slow, and mostly unnoticed. It curled into the hedgerows, ticked through tea-stained clocks, and hummed beneath the floorboards of stone cottages. Most days passed without hurry, and the rare arrival of a stranger was enough to stir curtains and spark conversation at the bakery. Broom Lane sat at the edge of this village, a winding, tree-canopied road leading nowhere in particular. At the far end, tucked behind overgrown laurel hedges, stood an old brick house known as Weatherby Hollow. Its windows were boarded, its garden wild, but on Thursday nights, just past midnight, music floated down the lane. A cello, slow and sorrowful. The villagers didn't speak of it often. When they did, it was with a cautious shrug or a quick subject change. It was the kind of thing that didn't trouble them so long as it kept to itself. That changed when Helen Marwood arrived. A former police archivist, Helen had retired to Penmere in search of quiet and clean air. She found both, but she also found an envelope tucked into her letterbox with no postage, no return name. Just her name, and inside, a clipping from an old regional newspaper. Local musician disappears hours before final performance. The article was dated 17 years ago. It named the missing musician as Evangeline Ray, a prodigy cellist and the last known resident of Weatherby Hollow. According to the piece, she had been scheduled to perform at the Penmere Church Hall. She never arrived. Her cello was found in the garden. No signs of struggle, no note. Helen stood in her front room, clipping in hand, and listened. That night, the music returned, low and mournful, drifting like fog. She made tea, pulled out a folder, and began taking notes. Some habits were hard to break. Story 2. The Cellist of Broom Lane. The next morning, Helen walked to Weatherby Hollow. The air held that faint scent of turned soil and old wood smoke, and frost glittered in the hedgerows. The house stood quiet beneath a tangled vine of wisteria, its windows like eyes that had long since stopped blinking. She didn't break in, not really. The gate was already ajar, the side door unlocked. Inside, dust lay thick, but the floor bore fresh footprints. Just one set. Small, narrow. A woman's. Helen stepped carefully through the foyer. Time had lived here, she thought, not just passed. The wallpaper had faded in the shape of old frames, and cobwebs held the corners like sleepy lace. In the living room, she found the cello. It stood upright beside the fireplace, a sheet of music on the stand. The title had faded, but one word remained. Adagio. Slow. She recognized the handwriting. Evangeline's from the old case files. Helen turned slowly. Someone had been living here, lightly, as if afraid to wake the walls. A mug in the sink, a book on the table. Dog-eared on a poem about silence. She returned home with more questions than answers. That evening, another envelope appeared at her door. This one contained a photocopy of Evangeline's last rehearsal schedule, annotated with notes. Too fast, must stretch here, and next to the final line, don't forget to breathe. A third envelope came the next morning, and then another. Each containing fragments, photos, sketches, diary entries. Helen understood what was happening. Someone wanted her to look again. So she did, and the music continued. By the end of the week, Helen had amassed a small archive, handwritten notes, faded photos, a single red ribbon tied in a knot. Someone had been leaving these things deliberately, always early morning, always in silence. She began walking Broom Lane in the hours before midnight. She listened to the cello from just outside the gate of Weatherby Hollow. It never played the same melody twice, but each performance carried a similar shape. Slow rise, aching center, breathless end. One night, Helen waited longer than usual and watched as a figure stepped from the back of the house. The woman, tall, with her hair braided down her back, carried nothing. She moved through the garden like memory itself, dissolving into mist as she passed behind the hedges. Helen called out, but the night swallowed her voice. The next morning, a final envelope. It held a single page from Evangeline's diary. There is music that doesn't want to be remembered. It wants to haunt. It wants to echo through hands not yet born. I didn't disappear. I folded. I became the space between the notes. Helen stood motionless by the window for a long time. The cello would play again. But she understood now. It wasn't Evangeline who was trapped. It was the song. That evening, for the first time, Helen brought her own notebook to Weatherby Hollow. She sat in the frostbitten garden, let the cold settle around her shoulders, and began writing. Not to solve a case, but to witness a performance no one else could. The cello began again, a slow, sorrowful piece. Helen listened. She wrote, and the silence between the notes welcomed her like a final curtain. Story 3, The Clockmaker's Daughters. The clocks in Eldershade struck noon at odd intervals. In the village square, the great brass bell tower chimed 13 beats just after 11. The mantel clock in the tea shop had long since given up on accuracy, but no one minded. Time moved slowly here, not linearly but gently, in swirls and pauses. At the edge of the square stood a crooked timber building with a fading sign, A. Morell and Daughters, Clockmakers, Repairs, Restoration. It had stood there for over a century. Most people assumed it was closed. The windows were dim, the display case empty, and the front door bore a sign that simply read, Patience. But when Anna Morell died, the door was unlocked for the first time in 20 years. The shop passed to her last living granddaughter, Elsie. A quiet watchmaker's apprentice from the coast, Elsie arrived wearing a navy coat, carrying a small suitcase, and a letter her grandmother had written but never sent. It said simply, "You'll hear them when they're ready." Inside, dust muted every surface. Clocks lined the walls. Grandfather clocks, carriage clocks, with wooden cuckoos, and glass domes ticking faintly under grime. None of them were in sync, but none of them had stopped. The air held a faint scent of cedar and oil, and something sweeter, like dried rose. Elsie moved slowly, trailing her hand across the old oak workbench. A small box sat in its center. Inside it, a key, not for any clock she recognized, but for a drawer beneath the stairs. The key turned easily. Inside the drawer was a wooden doll, a marionette carved with delicate detail. A girl in a red dress, her eyes painted blue, a silver thread tied around her wrist. The back of the doll's head opened like a locket. Tucked inside, a folded slip of paper. On it, a date, a set of coordinates, in one line of text in her grandmother's hand. Find what we forgot. Elsie folded the note carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. The coordinates pointed somewhere just beyond the village limits, into the wooded stretch known as Wick Hollow, a place of dense trees, slow bird song, and the quiet rustle of unseen things. As a child, she'd been told to stay away from it, but no one had ever said why. The next morning, she walked there. The woods greeted her with filtered sunlight and the smell of damp earth. She followed the map coordinates with an old compass from the shop, her grandmother's, she now realized. The brass was worn smooth from decades of use. Near a leaning birch tree, she found a stone marker sunk into the moss. It wasn't a grave, though it bore initials, LM, EM, and AM, her grandmother and two other Morell women. Beneath the stone, a small latch was built into the earth. Rusted, hidden, but still working. Inside was a narrow iron box wrapped in oilcloth. She took it back to the shop, heart steady but slow. Inside the box were pages of diagrams, clock blueprints, but different. They were layered, recursive, built with symbols and notations in multiple hands. At the bottom, a sealed letter. To our daughters, it began. The work we do is not only mechanical, it is mnemonic. Our clocks do not keep time. They hold it. If you are reading this, the others have passed. You are the last Morell, and it is your task now to listen. To repair not the machines, but the memories they contain. The final pages were schematics for a device that had never been built. A memory clock, each gear tied to a sound, a scent, a season. The notes listed 12 components, and where they had been hidden, within clocks all over Eldershade. Elsie looked up at the wall. The clocks ticked slowly, and then one by one began to chime, not in unison but in sequence, as if answering a call, as if remembering. Elsie pulled down the first clock, a worn mantelpiece model with Roman numerals and a brass pendulum. Inside its base, Behind the winding keyhole, she found the first piece, a gear marked with a small letter R and an engraving of a leaf. It wasn't part of the clock's mechanism. It didn't belong, and yet it fit perfectly in her palm. Each day she chose another. Some clocks resisted, ticking louder as she approached, or stopping altogether when she tried to move them. Others opened easily, yielding pieces of something much older than metal and spring. By the end of the week, she had 7 components. Each was engraved: a raindrop, a bird, a doorway, a hand. They weren't parts of a machine. They were symbols, fragments of memory rendered in brass. At night, the clocks would speak, not in words, but in the sound of dreams, a lullaby she half remembered, a ticking like her grandmother's knitting needles. Once she heard a voice murmur her name. One morning she woke to find a trail of fine clock dust leading into the back room. There, on the old table, lay the memory clock, assembled without her hands. The frame was old walnut. Its face had no numbers, only runes and shifting light. And in its heart, the marionette doll now sat, her silver thread looped around the central spindle. When Elsie turned the key, the shop fell still. The air thickened, then cleared, and the room filled with the scent of rosewater, the sound of summer rain, and the quiet, distinct echo of laughter. Her mother's, her grandmother's, her own. The memory clock wasn't a machine. It was a story, and it was waiting to be told. Elsie sat in the quiet for a long while, letting the sensations wash through her. It wasn't like a recording. The memories didn't just play. They unfolded, layered and real. She could almost feel her grandmother's arms around her, the warmth of sun on her childhood garden, the way her mother's voice cracked when she laughed. The clock pulsed with a low ticking, rhythmic and calm. It was breathing. She spent the following week cataloging what she could. Each evening she turned the key again, and the shop transformed. The scent of pine on a winter morning, the lull of tea being poured, the faint scraping of pencil on paper. Each one tied to a memory, none earth-shattering, but all deeply felt. Some days she wept, not from grief, but from the gentleness of it all, as if the past wasn't asking to be mourned, but witnessed, honored. When the 12th night came, she found the final component, a tiny brass bird tucked inside the hollow base of a broken regulator. As she placed it into the memory clock's final slot, the doll at its center shifted. The silver thread tugged softly, aligning the gears. The runes on the face of the clock glowed briefly, then faded. And then silence. Not an emptiness, but a fullness, as if the story had finished being told. Elsie locked the door to the shop that night for the first time. But inside, the clocks kept time. Not for the world, but for memory. And they would keep ticking as long as someone listened. Story 4, The Bellwether Murders. It started with a file that shouldn't have existed. The Bellwether Municipal Archive wasn't the kind of place where people expected scandal. Built in 1893, it resembled a courthouse or a library, red brick walls, long oak tables, and windows that always seemed a little too high to look out of. It housed permits, birth certificates, land deeds, and the quiet dust of town history. Lena Harrow, a 33-year-old part-time archivist, thought she'd seen everything. She liked the work. It was quiet, predictable. But one rainy Tuesday morning in late October, while cataloging marriage licenses from 1958, she opened a misfiled envelope marked simply, Bellwether, 1962-63, case redacted. Inside was a single black and white photograph, a woman lying on a forest floor. Her shoes were missing, her hands folded at her chest like someone had posed her. Lena didn't recognize the name stamped on the folder tab, R. Farnsworth, but the envelope was real. The wax seal matched official police evidence stamps from the 1960s. There had never been a murder listed in the archive's public index for that year. She took the file home. She wasn't supposed to, but some things didn't belong under fluorescent lights. That night, she read the attached report, one that had been carbon copied 4 times and then heavily redacted in pen. Only fragments were legible. Similar pattern to initial incident near the orchard. Third woman found posed, no signs of struggle. Local law enforcement instructed to suppress details due to. The final line was chilling. even through the smudged ink. Expected recurrence within the season. Bellwether had a serial case, and someone had buried it. Lena couldn't sleep. She kept the folder on her kitchen table, lit only by the yellow halo of her desk lamp. The more she read, the more inconsistencies she found. Witness names blacked out, evidence logged, then retracted. Time of death fields left blank. 3 women, possibly more, each found at the start of autumn, each missing shoes, each with their hands placed as if they were laid in a casket. She went back to the archive the next morning before it opened, heart ticking like a wristwatch wound too tight. The municipal case files for 1962 were still missing from the official drawer, but the Farnsworth file had a sister document hidden behind a stack of zoning maps, a handwritten ledger. Lena flipped through it slowly. Names, dates, addresses, and there they were, the victims. Not under crime records, but under medical logs, listed as cold exposure and natural causes. She copied the names and addresses, then she took a walk. Bellwether wasn't big. A few streets wound through old neighborhoods, where residents still swept their porches and waved to strangers. Lena visited 2 homes, both empty, both owned by women who had died in the 1960s, both untouched since. At the 3rd house, she found an old woman gardening. Mrs. Elspeth Walker, 86, still wore gloves and used a hand trowel like it was second nature. When Lena asked her about 1962, the woman paused, then looked sharply at the house. "That year," she said, voice thin, "they said it was pneumonia, all of them, even when they weren't coughing." Lena asked who they were. Mrs. Walker only replied, "People with uniforms and secrets." That night, Lena returned to the archive and lit a candle. She pulled every local paper from autumn 1962. Most said nothing, but one obituary caught her attention. It ended with a curious line. "In accordance with family wishes, no shoes were worn." Lena felt the hairs on her arms rise. The next folder she opened had a single document inside, typed, unsigned, dated October 1963. "He returns with the leaves. We know how he chooses, and we know why they pretend not to." The page was stamped in red ink, "Destroy after reading." Lena folded it twice and slipped it into her coat. The phrase clung to her mind all the way home. "He returns with the leaves." Who was he? A local man? A drifter? Someone woven into Bellwether's sleepy autumns so tightly that no one dared pull the thread? She needed someone who might remember. The next morning, she visited the library across town, where the town's former police chief, Howard Merton, now volunteered in the genealogy room. He was 90 if he was a day, and his hearing came and went like a faulty radio. But when Lena mentioned 1962, he sat very still. "They told us not to call them murders," he said at last. "Just strange deaths, said it was exposure, hysteria, that we should focus on upcoming elections, not panic." He leaned closer. "But I saw the 3rd one, Annabelle Creel, folded up neat like she'd been laid in a church pew, her hair braided, no shoes, a ribbon in her hands. No one puts a ribbon in their hands." Lena asked who gave the orders to suppress the details. Chief Merton hesitated. "County men, not our own. Big coats, federal tone. Said she fit a profile. Told us if we wanted the town budget renewed, we'd keep our mouths shut." He glanced around the quiet room, then whispered, "They said he only comes when no one's watching. That's how he chooses." The lantern in the archive burned late that night. Lena reopened the Farnsworth file and laid out the pages, photographs, and scraps of redacted testimony. One detail kept echoing back: the ribbon. It was red, silk, and in all 3 cases it had been knotted exactly the same. Lena turned over the last photo. Someone had written on the back in pencil, "October knows." She stared at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Outside, the wind had changed direction, and the leaves began to fall. The next day, Lena packed a small bag with a flashlight, a notebook, and the redacted file. She followed the address on the oldest report, a stretch of forested land outside Bellwether, near an abandoned apple orchard. The trees there had grown gnarled and wild, their branches casting lace-like shadows on the forest floor. Few people visited anymore. The path was narrow, overgrown, and quiet. As Lena reached the clearing, she saw it. 3 stone markers half buried in leaves. No names, just small, flat stones, unmarked save for a carved symbol, an oak leaf, a crescent moon, and a ribbon. The air felt still, cold. She crouched beside the 3rd marker and brushed away the moss. Beneath it was a rusted tin box sealed with wax. Inside, she found a final report, typed and unsigned. Dated October 1964. The pattern repeats. Victims are chosen for solitude, for silence. The red ribbon is a mark, not left by the killer, but by those who knew. They marked them in hope someone would remember. At the bottom was a handwritten note. One more expected, October 1965. Lena stepped back, heart pounding. She looked around the clearing and something caught her eye, a shape in the trees. Someone watching. When she turned, no one was there. Back at the archive that evening, she unlocked a drawer she'd never opened before. Inside was an old police ledger. On the inside cover, a message etched into the leather. Keep the records, keep the silence. Lena understood now. The silence wasn't accidental. It had been policy. She closed the drawer. She turned off the light. But she left the red ribbon on the desk. A marker, in case someone else came looking. The first frost came early that year. Lena kept the red ribbon in her coat pocket as the days shortened. She returned to the orchard clearing every few nights, taking photographs, mapping the stones, tracing the patterns carved beneath the moss. The more she searched, the more she began to notice small anomalies, tree bark scraped with symbols, small offerings buried in shallow earth, and once the sound of footsteps that never resolved into a figure. Then came the 4th stone. It appeared without sound or ceremony, just beyond the others. Freshly placed, the dirt unsettled. This one bore no symbol, only a date, October 16th, 1965. The victim from the note, but there had never been a body listed. Back at the archive, Lena tore into the uncatalogued records from 1965. In a ledger of public utilities, she found an anomaly. One electricity meter registered as active for a cottage that no longer existed. The address had been scratched out, but she found it anyway, at the edge of county maps, where the road disappeared into wetland. The cottage was there, half collapsed, time-bitten. But inside, she found boxes of evidence. Polaroids, ribbons, a coil of tape recordings. One tape was marked in fading ink, "Don't let October forget." She played it that night. A voice crackled through. He follows quiet, finds the ones no one checks on, marks them, leaves them posed. The town looks away, always has. They made us forget, but I won't. I won't. Click. Lena sat still for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and began transcribing everything. Every name, every ribbon, every omission. She didn't know if anyone would read it, but she knew one thing now. October remembers. And this time, so would Bellwether. Story 5. The Phantom of Ashwood Cemetery. In the sleepy village of Ashwood, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, residents often spoke of strange occurrences in the local cemetery. For years, townsfolk claimed to hear soft footsteps among the tombstones late at night. Some swore they saw shadowy figures tending to graves under the moonlight. Most dismissed these tales as mere superstition until one fateful morning when groundskeeper Harold Finch stumbled upon something peculiar. Rows of freshly planted flowers adorned several neglected graves, their vibrant colors standing out against the gray stones. No one admitted responsibility, nor did anyone recall ordering such arrangements. As days turned into weeks, more graves were decorated, always during the dead of night. Curiosity turned to concern when authorities noticed that only certain graves received attention, those belonging to individuals who had died under suspicious circumstances. A retired detective named Margaret Lane took interest in the phenomenon. She began keeping watch over the cemetery, determined to uncover the truth. One chilly October evening, she finally caught sight of the midnight gardener. To her astonishment, it wasn't a ghostly apparition, but a frail elderly man named Thomas Reed. When questioned, Thomas revealed that he had once worked as a private investigator and spent decades trying to bring justice to forgotten victims. Planting flowers was his way of honoring their memory and ensuring they weren't forgotten. Through painstaking analysis, Thomas identified recurring motifs in Rachel's work that corresponded to real-life victims whose cases had gone cold. One painting depicted a stormy seascape with ghostly faces emerging from the waves. Another showed a shadowy figure atop a cliff, gazing down at a body washed ashore below. These eerie visuals became key pieces of evidence, reigniting interest in solving the murders. Detectives revisited old files, cross-referencing details from Rachel's art with missing persons reports. Slowly, a pattern emerged. All victims had ties to a secretive organization operating along the coast. Though unable to prosecute due to lack of physical evidence, authorities exposed the group's activities, forcing them to disband. Rachel's paintings now hang in galleries worldwide, serving as both memorials to the lost and warnings to those who seek to exploit others. To this day, visitors claim to hear faint whispers emanating from her canvases, as if Rachel herself is watching over the living, ensuring her voice and the voices of the forgotten are finally heard. Story 6, The Midnight Passenger. On a foggy autumn evening in 1956, a train traveling from London to Edinburgh made an unscheduled stop near the remote village of Blackthorn Hollow. Passengers reported seeing a lone figure, a woman in a flowing white gown, standing on the tracks ahead. The conductor sounded the horn repeatedly, but the figure remained motionless, vanishing into thin air just before the train screeched to a halt. When the crew investigated, they found no sign of the woman or any evidence that she had ever been there. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by whispers of a ghost haunting the railway line. Locals claimed the woman was Eleanor Whitmore, a passenger who had vanished from the very same train exactly 20 years earlier. Her disappearance had baffled investigators, leaving behind only cryptic clues: a torn piece of fabric caught on a fence post, a single glove found near the tracks, and eyewitness accounts describing a shadowy figure seen walking away from the scene. Detective Harold Finch reopened the case, poring over old records and interviewing surviving witnesses. He discovered that Eleanor had been traveling alone, carrying little more than a small suitcase and a notebook filled with sketches. The notebook, recovered from her belongings, contained drawings of landscapes, people, and strange symbols that seemed to form a cipher. Finch suspected the symbols might hold the key to unraveling the mystery. Finch enlisted the help of a cryptography expert to decode the cipher, eventually revealing a series of coordinates pointing to locations along the railway route. Each site held fragments of Eleanor's story: a letter hidden beneath a loose floorboard in an abandoned station, a locket buried near a derelict bridge, and a faded photograph tucked inside a hollow tree stump. Piecing these items together, Finch uncovered a tragic narrative of betrayal and loss. Eleanor had been fleeing an abusive relationship, seeking refuge with a distant relative in Scotland. However, her ex-husband, a wealthy industrialist, had hired a private investigator to track her down. The investigator intercepted Eleanor at Blackthorn Hollow, forcing her off the train under threat of violence. Witnesses later described seeing a man dragging a struggling woman into the woods, though no conclusive evidence tied him to the crime. Though the statute of limitations had long since expired, Finch managed to locate the investigator, now an elderly man living in seclusion. Confronted with the evidence, he confessed to his role in Eleanor's abduction, claiming he had acted under duress. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he muttered, tears streaming down his face. "But once I started, there was no turning back." With the truth finally brought to light, the villagers of Blackthorn Hollow erected a memorial near the site where Eleanor was last seen. Every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, locals gather to lay flowers and share stories, ensuring her memory endures. To this day, passengers report seeing a spectral figure standing on the tracks, her presence a haunting reminder of the past and a plea for remembrance. Story 7, The Silent Witness. On a foggy spring morning, fisherman Joe Callahan discovered Rachel Monroe's lifeless body floating near the pier. Initial reports suggested foul play, but evidence was scarce. No signs of struggle marred her pristine workspace, and her belongings appeared untouched. Detectives were baffled until they examined her journals, which hinted at paranoia and obsession. Rachel's writings described hearing whispers carried by the wind, urging her to paint the truth. She mentioned encounters with shadowy figures and referenced a lighthouse keeper who frequented her studio. Further investigation revealed that the keeper, Thomas Reed, had once worked as a private investigator specializing in cold cases. Thomas confessed to planting flowers on forgotten graves, believing Rachel's art held clues to unsolved murders. Together with detectives, he pieced together a chilling conspiracy involving powerful elites. Though Rachel's death went officially unsolved, her legacy lived on through her paintings, which continued to inspire hope and fear in equal measure. Through painstaking analysis, Thomas identified recurring motifs in Rachel's work that corresponded to real-life victims whose cases had gone cold. One painting depicted a stormy seascape with ghostly faces emerging from the waves. Another showed a shadowy figure atop a cliff, gazing down at a body washed ashore below. These eerie visuals became key pieces of evidence, reigniting interest in solving the murders. Detectives revisited old files, cross-referencing details from Rachel's art with missing persons reports. Slowly, a pattern emerged. All victims had ties to a secretive organization operating along the coast. Though unable to prosecute due to lack of physical evidence, authorities exposed the group's activities, forcing them to disband. Rachel's paintings now hang in galleries worldwide, serving as both memorials to the lost and warnings to those who seek to exploit others. To this day, visitors claim to hear faint whispers emanating from her canvases, as if Rachel herself is watching over the living, ensuring her voice and the voices of the forgotten are finally heard. To honor Rachel's memory, Thomas embarked on a personal mission to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. He traveled to neighboring towns, interviewing families of the victims and collecting testimonies that painted a grim picture of corruption and abuse of power. Each story reinforced his belief that Rachel had been silenced because she knew too much. One particularly troubling account came from a woman named Mary Ellis, whose husband had disappeared years earlier. Mary claimed that her husband had stumbled upon incriminating documents linking local officials to illegal smuggling operations. Shortly afterward, he vanished without a trace. Mary believed Rachel's paintings included subtle references to her husband's fate, pointing to a secluded cove where smugglers often docked their boats. Guided by these clues, Thomas organized a search party and scoured the cove. Beneath layers of seaweed and debris, they uncovered remnants of clothing, personal effects, and even skeletal remains. Forensic analysis confirmed that some of the bones belonged to individuals listed as missing persons. While the discovery didn't bring closure to every case, it provided answers for several grieving families. In the end, Rachel Monroe's art transcended its original purpose, becoming a beacon of truth in a world clouded by lies. Though justice came too late for her, her legacy endured, inspiring others to seek accountability and remember those who might otherwise be forgotten. To this day, the cliffs of Seabrook remain a place of quiet reflection, where the wind carries whispers of a woman who dared to speak for the silent. Story 8. The Forgotten Lighthouse. Perched on a rocky outcrop at the edge of the world, the lighthouse at Devil's Cove has stood sentinel for over a century. Once a beacon guiding sailors safely through treacherous waters, it now sits abandoned, its lantern dark and its walls crumbling with age. But despite its desolation, the lighthouse refuses to fade from memory, not because of its history, but because of the strange occurrences that plague those who dare approach it. Built in 1887, the lighthouse was manned by a solitary keeper named Elias Grayson, a reclusive man who rarely interacted with the outside world. For decades, he maintained the light faithfully, ensuring ships navigated safely past the jagged reefs below. Then, one stormy night in 1924, the light went out. A rescue crew dispatched to investigate found the lighthouse deserted, with no sign of Elias. His logbook lay open on the desk. Its final entry dated the previous evening. "The shadows move when I'm not looking." Rumors swirled about Elias's fate. Some said he had succumbed to madness, driven insane by isolation and the relentless howling of the wind. Others whispered of supernatural forces lurking in the cove, preying on anyone foolish enough to stay too long. Over time, the lighthouse fell into disrepair, becoming little more than a local legend told to frighten children. In 2009, a team of paranormal investigators revisited Devil's Cove, equipped with modern technology designed to detect anomalies. Their equipment picked up unusual electromagnetic fluctuations and audio recordings filled with faint whispers repeating phrases like, "come closer," and "you shouldn't be here." One investigator claimed to see shadowy figures darting between the trees, though his colleagues saw nothing. When reviewing the footage later, they noticed something unsettling: a figure standing just behind the camera operator, partially obscured by foliage, watching silently. Determined to uncover the truth, Detective Sarah Klein joined the investigation, poring over Elias's logbook and interviewing descendants of the original builders. She learned that the lighthouse had been constructed on land once inhabited by a Native American tribe who believed the cove was a gateway to the spirit world. According to legend, the tribe performed rituals to seal the gateway, warning that disturbing the site would unleash unspeakable horrors. Klein also discovered that Elias had been fascinated by the occult, filling his journals with diagrams of pentagrams and instructions for summoning spirits. One entry described a vision of shadowy figures emerging from the sea, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Could Elias have inadvertently opened the gateway, dooming himself and others to eternal torment? To prevent further incidents, Klein organized a team to perform a ritual designed to seal the gateway permanently. Using information gleaned from Elias's journals and consultations with tribal elders, they gathered materials and performed the ceremony during a lunar eclipse. As they chanted the incantation, the air grew heavy and ghostly apparitions materialized around them. Among them was Elias, his face twisted in anguish, pleading for release. Ignoring his cries, the team completed the ritual, causing the apparitions to vanish in a flash of blinding light. Though the immediate threat was neutralized, Klein couldn't shake the feeling that the gateway remained unstable, waiting for another opportunity to reopen. To this day, the lighthouse stands as a monument to tragedy and hubris, its forgotten halls echoing with the whispers of those who dared delve too deeply into its mysteries. Story 9. The Drowned Bride. On the shores of Lake Elderglow, nestled between mist-shrouded mountains, lies a small chapel abandoned for nearly 2 centuries. Its crumbling walls and shattered stained glass windows tell the story of a love lost to time, and perhaps something darker. Locals speak in hushed tones of the drowned bride, a spectral figure said to haunt the lake, her flowing white gown perpetually soaked and her eyes filled with sorrow. The tale begins in 1792 when a wealthy merchant named Thomas Alden arranged a marriage between his daughter Eleanor and a nobleman from a neighboring province. Though Eleanor loved another, a humble blacksmith named William, she obeyed her father's wishes, believing duty outweighed desire. On the eve of her wedding, she visited the chapel to pray for guidance. Witnesses claimed to see her walking toward the lake shortly afterward, clutching a bouquet of wilted flowers. She was never seen again. Search parties dragged the lake for days, but found no body. Instead, they uncovered a series of letters hidden beneath the chapel floorboards. Written by Eleanor, they revealed her anguish at being forced into marriage and hinted at a pact made with the lake itself. "If my heart cannot belong to him," she wrote, "then let it belong to none." Years passed and stories of the drowned bride spread. Fishermen reported seeing a pale figure gliding across the water, her hair trailing behind her like seaweed. Boats passing too close to the center of the lake would inexplicably capsize, leaving survivors shaken and unwilling to speak of what they saw. Some claimed the bride sought revenge for her stolen happiness. Others believed she guarded a secret buried deep beneath the waves. In 1980, divers exploring the lake discovered a wooden chest encrusted with algae and barnacles. Inside, they found jewelry, letters, and a locket containing portraits of Eleanor and William. Among the items was a journal written by Thomas Alden, detailing his guilt over forcing the union and his belief that the lake had claimed Eleanor as punishment. Since then, sightings of the drowned bride have grown less frequent, though locals insist she still watches over the waters, waiting for someone to reunite her with the man she loved. Detective Margaret Lane took an interest in the case, drawn by the tragic romance at its core. Her investigation led her to interview descendants of both Eleanor and William, uncovering a heartbreaking narrative of forbidden love and betrayal. She learned that William had attempted to rescue Eleanor from the lake, diving repeatedly until exhaustion claimed his life. Their bodies were never recovered, fueling rumors that they had become eternal guardians of the lake. Lane also explored the possibility that Eleanor's disappearance was linked to a curse placed on the Alden family generations earlier. According to legend, A scorned witch had vowed to claim the soul of every Alden bride, ensuring that their marriages would end in tragedy. Could Eleanor's fate have been preordained, a sacrifice demanded by vengeful spirits? To honor Eleanor and William's memory, Lane organized a memorial service at the lake, inviting villagers to share their stories of love and loss. As candles floated on the water and mourners sang hymns, a sense of peace settled over the area. Some claimed to see a pair of figures standing hand in hand on the shore, their faces serene and content. Others swore the water shimmered with an otherworldly glow, as if the lake itself was offering forgiveness. Though the mystery of the drowned bride remains unsolved, her legend serves as a reminder of the enduring power of love, even in death. To this day, visitors leave offerings of flowers and ribbons at the edge of the lake, hoping to appease the restless spirits and ensure safe passage for future travelers. For those who dare to listen, the whispers of the past continue to echo across the waters, carrying messages of hope, sorrow, and redemption. As the final page closes and the fog gently lifts from these quiet corners of the world, may your mind be at peace, wrapped in the calm hush of these mysteries. Thank you for listening, dear dreamer. Sleep well. The stories will wait for you.